Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about the fundamental principles of the American Constitution. And as we've talked about in class, our founding fathers were brilliant people, but they did not come up with the ideas for our government out of nowhere. And during this process, they were guided by these principles or ideals that our government wants to live by. So take a look at some of the important ones. First, let's define fundamental principles. Fundamental political principles define and shape the American constitutional government. So these ideas are what kind of shape our government. Fundamental political principles. So the ones that we're going to go over today are the consent of the governed, limited government, rule of law, democracy, representative government or representative democracy. When you hear those two terms, they mean basically the same thing. We'll use them interchangeably. Direct democracy, majority rules, and minority rights. So first, consent of the governed. Make sure you have your note sheet out and you're writing down these definitions. We need to do both the questions on the Ed puzzle and the questions on our note sheet, filling in our note sheet. So consent of the governed means the people are the source of any and all governmental power, not a king. The power comes from the people. So let's look at what we mean by consent. Consent means that we give our permission to be governed by our country's government. A lot of philosophers feel that if the people didn't give their consent, we could rise up and overtake the government. So by not doing that, we're kind of showing our consent. We show our consent by voting and participating in the process, participating in government, like running for office, campaigning for candidates, and also not having a revolution. Protesting is a way to show we don't give our consent. So when people go out and do the Women's March or something like that, they're showing we don't give our consent to this. We are opposed to this. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, the purpose of the government, which is to protect people's rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. So this idea of consent of the governed comes right from the Declaration of Independence. So here are some images of examples of people not giving their consent or consenting. This is women in Morocco protesting their lack of equal rights. And here are some people who are giving their consent, who are participating. This is a picture from the 2005 Iraqi elections and how important it was to these people to participate in government, and they were giving their consent to having a democracy and a way to have their voice. And in Saudi Arabia, women were, consenting and directing the government because they got the right to vote in Saudi Arabia in 2011. The suffragette arrested for trying to vote. Women got the right to vote in the USA in 1920. Just kind of some side information that I think it's good to know that where we kind of stand in the world. Oftentimes we think that we are thought leaders in democracy, but actually women got the right to vote after several other countries. New Zealand was the first to give women the right to vote in 1893, followed by Australia. And you can see that we are way down. We're we're way down on the list of countries that gave women the right to vote. So I just think that's kind of interesting to note. All right, and the next fundamental principle is limited government. And we've been talking about that, about limiting the power of government, because we don't want a dictator, right? So our definition of limited government is the government is not all-powerful and may do only those things that the people have given it the power to do. So there are, in the world today, there are lots of countries that don't have limited government. You can see the red here on the map are all the countries that have dictatorships, which means that they're not limited. They can do whatever they want to. The rights of the people do not matter. Yellow is where there's freedom and there is limited government, and then there are places in the world that are somewhere in between, and those are the green on here. So some examples of people who are not limited is Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He can do whatever he wants to. He can take people's lives. He can take their property. He can tell them what to do. He's taken away all their freedom because he's not limited. His power is not limited. Muammar Gaddafi is another dictator in existence. Here's some people in Moscow who they were protesting the expansion of power by Putin because he's been acting more and more like a dictator in Russia. Another dictator, Russia, more of the protests in Russia. People who are imprisoned without rights. In some parts of the world, they don't have due process rights or our trial rights, Fifth, Sixth Amendment rights. And we have those that limit the power of the government. So how is the government limited? First of all, we can alter it. People can alter it by voting different people in and out of office. We can protest, and we can amend the Constitution. If we really feel like our values have changed as a nation, we have the power to change the Constitution through the amendment process. The Constitution limits the government. The government is only allowed to do the things that the Constitution tells it to do. When we look at Article 1, 2, and 3 in the Constitution, that's the rule book for the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And they're only allowed to do the things that it says in there. We also separate our powers in order for no part of the government to become too powerful. That we have the legislative branch that makes the laws, and totally separate from that is the executive branch that is carrying out the laws, and then the judicial branch is interpreting the laws and making sure that they're applied fairly. But we separate that out so that it's one part doesn't get too powerful. And then we also have checks and balances of ways that we can check the power of different people, different parts of the government. For instance, if the legislative branch passes a law that the executive branch doesn't like, they can veto it. The legislative branch then can override a veto with 2/3 of vote. But there are ways that they can check each other in case one part of the government is taking the country in a direction that people don't want it to go, or starting to act like a dictator and starting to act that they're above the law. And then there's federalism. That's another way we limit it. There's some things that our national government does, that the United States government is in charge of, and other things that our state governments are in charge of. And by separating that out, we also limit the power of any one of those governments. We also believe in the rule of law. This is another one of the fundamental principles that is very important in our nation. And the definition of that is that all people, including those that govern, are bound by the law. Everyone must obey the law. So even if you're a Supreme Court justice, you have to follow the speed limit just like anyone else. If a senator, who's someone who governs, if they committed murder, then they have to go to trial just like anybody else. People in government have to pay taxes just like everybody else. They have to follow the law. No one in our country is above the law. Democracy is a little tricky because we're going to be talking about different types of democracy. So the definition I want you guys to write down is that it's a system of government. So in a democratic system of government, the people rule. So with democracy, in this case, we might compare it to a dictatorship in which the dictator rules, or we might compare it to a monarchy in which the king and queen rule. But in democracy, the people rule. We'll also look at representative government, which is representative democracy. They're the same thing. And in a representative system of government, people elect public office holders to make laws and conduct government on their behalf. And we have a picture here of President Bush saying that they'll preserve and defend the Constitution of the United States, because the Constitution is the rule book everyone must follow. But when we have a representative democracy, it's that we elect people who have the same values as us, who we think will carry out the laws the same way we would want them to, because we can't all go down to Congress and vote on different laws. We don't have the time for that. It would be logistically impossible. Some of us, we can't be experts on every part of every law, and so we elect people to represent us and to go down and make the laws and vote on those things on our behalf. Whereas a direct democracy means that everybody votes on every issue. So when everyone votes directly on an issue. For instance, if the city wanted to create a new park, and then everyone goes down and votes yes or no on the park, we're not voting for a person to make that decision for us. Maybe I vote for somebody who's very pro-environment because that reflects my values, and then I let that person decide whether or not to vote on a park. Would be representative democracy. Direct democracy means we vote directly on them. This comes into play in our current system when there's a ballot initiative, or in the state of Virginia, when we need to amend the Constitution, the people vote on that directly. One time there was an amendment about whether or not our state Senate should meet on religious holidays, and they had to change the Constitution to make that not happen. And so the people had to vote on that directly. Okay, so in the example of the park, how would that be handled in a representative democracy differently than a direct democracy? Another important fundamental principle is majority rule. Majority rule means that decisions are determined by the most people and the government abides by their wishes. This is something that we're very familiar with nowadays. If we want to order a pizza in our family, it's like, just vote on, do we want pepperoni or we want plain cheese? Vote, and whichever one gets the most votes wins. So we're very familiar with that, but it hasn't always been the way that decisions are made, and in some countries it still doesn't mean anything. So this is to help you with your assignment coming up when we're going to do superheroes. My superhero is Constitution Girl. And here's an example for majority rule, where this group of people is saying, help Constitution Girl, we don't know what to do. We have to decide if we're going to do a poster for our project or a PowerPoint. The teacher will only let us do one. Help us. And Constitution Girl comes in to save the day. That's easy. Take a vote, and whichever gets the most votes gets to have what they want. That's called majority rule. Another part of that, though, is minority rights. The minority rights means even though the majority rules, those in the minority have individual rights which must be protected. So everyone gets their First Amendment rights, their Second Amendment rights, their Third Amendment rights, their Fourth Amendment rights, no matter what. Those are protected. And we talked a little bit about how it doesn't, when we hear this term, we often think of minority in terms of race or in terms of religion, but it also has to do with opinion. So if somebody has a minority opinion, we still have to have an open mind and take their thoughts into consideration when the majority is ruling. So minority rights, even if your opinion is in the minority, you have the freedom of speech. Even if your religion is in the minority, you have freedom of religion. Even if your newspaper prints things that some people find offensive, you have the freedom of press. So what is important to understand about this? Fundamental political principles define and shape the American constitutional government. Go ahead and write an answer to this question. What are the fundamental political principles that have shaped the government of the United States? And how much do you remember? You're going to answer these on the back of your note sheet. So if you need to go back and fill in any notes, please do so now, and also please answer these questions on your paper.